This week on Dig Me Out. With your hosts, Jason Zia and Tim Minichi.
Jay, we're back again with another episode thanks to our Dig Me Out Union on Patreon. You can help us make the next episode happen by joining us at dmounion.com or digmeoutunion.com. And Jay, this is a combo episode because we're talking about an album that was a winner of one of our tournaments of death. One of our fight till the end, maybe even have a tie. 27 albums enter, one album leaves, except two albums decided to leave. And it just so happened they were both suggested by the same person. So we thought, that's pretty cool. And then we should have him on.
He's got the magic touch.
How many albums, Vadim Taver, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
How many albums did you have in total in those polls that made it? Was it just those two?
Well, I had one in each of the three subsequent tournament showdowns, whatever you guys call them, and then each one made it to the final round. So I had three in the final.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah, 3 out of the 7, and so the odds were in your favor, as President Snow would say. So
you've got the pulse of the taste of our listeners, I think.
Not really.
Patrons.
No, not really. Sometimes. I
don't know.
Yeah.
I think this month you did.
This month I did.
This
yeah.
month definitely.
Tune, man.
So let's get into what was in these polls, so we can talk about the record that we are going to talk about. The first round was Richard Waterman suggesting Candlebox Happy Pills, Adam Smith, The Godfather's Unreal World, Willie Dillon suggested Flake Music, When You Land Here, It's Time to Return. Joe B suggested Transistor's Self-Titled. Kyle Bittner suggested, I don't know how to pronounce this, Yurosi Yatsura. I feel like that was put in there specifically to trip me up. And their album.
Yes, the band was created and named to
exactly
just throw you off.
Oh, it's going to get worse. We Are Yurosi Yatsura is the name of the album. Then Lauren suggested Psychomoto Goat. Seriously.
Love it.
Their album Braille. And then here's one of Vadim's picks. Uncle's Science Fiction, which is, of all the albums that have just been mentioned, not only, well, I know the Candlebox record, but that one I'm actually very familiar with. And then Jeff Krieg suggested Massacre Methadrone by Brian Jonestown. Massacre, which we've talked about. And then Dick Schleif, sorry if I mispronounced that, Dick. He suggested the album Mega Crush by My Name. And the winners out of this round, there were 3. Candlebox, Yurosi Yatsura. Again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. And Uncle. So round 2. Guess who shows up again? It's Vadim with Jets to Brazil's Orange Rhyming Dictionary. Also, there you go. And he's got it on vinyl right there. Very nice. Is that the original press from J Tree, or is that a repress?
It's a repress on Epitaph.
Got it.
Yeah.
I wonder if J Tree even did it. I mean, I'm guessing they did.
They did. Yeah, they did.
It was probably a very limited run, and it probably costs a lot of money now.
Maybe.
I feel like all 90s records are either really expensive that came out on vinyl, or they're not worth anything.
J Tree not so much, because J Tree was like a punk rooted label. So I mean, a lot of the stuff they put out on vinyl people were buying because it was like, it was more common. It wasn't like a major label.
Got it. Richard Waterman in this round suggested Power Trip by Monster Magnet. Willie Dillon, Do Not Tailgate by Fireside. Joby, Guide to Better Living by Grinspoon. Jeff Krieg, Knock Knock by Smog. Chuck, Horse-Drawn Wishes by Roller Skate Skinny. Gabriel Gutierrez, Acid Bath, When the Kite String Pops. James Elliker, Truly, Fast Stories from Coma Kid. And Tom Cole, Play Parts 1 and 5 by Green Romance Orchestra. Out of this one, our winners were Monster Magnet, and Just to Brazil. So now Vadim's 2 for 2 in these polls. If
He's feeling cocky.
I feel like you could, this is like a parlay kind of bet option, bet situation here. If you could package all these into one series of bets, you'd like do really well at the racetrack. So last round, Richard Waterman, 6x7, The Things We Make. Willie Dillon, Finger 11, Tip. Joe B, Chopper 1, Now Playing. Joe B got one in each round as well, but he didn't make it out of the rounds. That was tough. Jeff K, Silver Jews, American Water. Vadim. Drugstore by Drugstore. Tom Cole, Soul Asylums, Let Your Dim Light Shine. Lars Lindblad. Mike Watt, Ball Hog or Tugboat. Scott Witt suggested the self-titled album by Demolition 23. And lastly, Rochester Dunningham. That's a very cool name, by the way. Kicking in the Water by the Gand Harvest. Out of that round, Mike Watt and Drugstore. So going into the final, there were 7 albums because we did have a tie. Just to Brazil and Uncle were the 2 winners. So Vadim had both the winners, but they tied at 29%. So then it went to a runoff, a 24-hour runoff. I want to just say I made a nice graphic for this. I got 2 old-timey boxers and put the album covers on their bodies. I think that looked pretty cool. That's my Canva design skills.
It's also my fault you had to do that because I forgot to vote in my.
Oh my!
Oh, what?
So I would have been the deciding vote for my album, whichever one that would have been.
Man.
Do you know who you would have voted for?
Yeah, I voted for Uncle.
And here we are. Uncle didn't win.
Oh,
the final.
That's messed up.
Yeah,
So we're going to
okay.
talk about Jets to Brazil's Orange Rhyming
Well,
Dictionary.
I think it was time to do this record because this was in the March poll nominated by Willie Dillon.
Okay.
So it had gotten close before. So it feels right that we finally got to it.
Okay. So, Vadim, you suggested this record at the beginning of this tournament. So I'm going to ask you, when did you get? I'm assuming you were into Jawbreaker before this, and so you naturally.
Kind of.
What's your history with this band?
Yeah. So I mean, I was with them from the beginning, just because of the people involved. I'm sure you guys read the history. It's kind of like a super group at the time, because Blake obviously came from Jawbreaker, which were pretty huge. And then I actually was most familiar with Chris Daly's work, the drummer, because he came from Texas Is the Reason, and I was a huge Texas Is the Reason fan at that time. He also came from a hardcore band before that called Resurrection from New Jersey that I liked. And then Jeremy was in Handsome before that, although he sang in Handsome and he played bass in here. And then before the record was even out, they had a guitar player who played in a really great punk hardcore band called Lifetime, who were also on J-Tree as well. And I was a huge fan of Lifetime. So I was very familiar. I mean, it was a big deal. Like everybody, who kind of knew what was going on in those scenes was very aware of Jets to Brazil. But to be honest, I didn't get into them in 1998. I got into them in 1999. I kind of missed the release, and this isn't like, I can't just like click on Spotify and listen to it. Like it had to be a little while before I purchased it.
Right.
But yeah, I was a big fan of the J-Tree roster, to be honest with you. I was a big fan of a lot of bands on that label. Lifetime, there was a Philly band called Kid Dynamite that was pretty big at the time. Strike Anywhere, those were more like punk hardcore bands. And then Promise Ring, Pedro the Lion, and a band called Denali I was really into. So yeah, I mean, underneath that J-Tree umbrella, there was a pretty big buzz about Jets to Brazil and for who was involved. And actually, until I started doing a little bit of researching here for this episode, I had no clue that this was the best-selling release on J-Tree. That actually kind of blew my mind because there's just so many great releases on that label. But yeah, it's kind of weird that this was number one. So yeah, that's my history. I got into it a little bit later in 1999, a little bit later, meaning like in a few months after it had come out. And I did get to see them that year, and I had to look it up online because there's no history of the show anywhere. I was like, am I imagining that I was at the show? I think I messaged you about it, Tim.
Mhm.
And then I actually like hit up a bunch of my friends. I was like, this show happened, right? Like, I'm not like hallucinating, right? And they're like, yeah, it happened. So it was when Hot Water Music, they had a history of breaking up and getting back together, but this was one of the times they broke up and then they got back together. So it was billed as sort of like a Hot Water Music reunion show with Jets to Brazil and a band from the like Washington DC area called 400 Years opening. So that's the only time that I saw the band was just on this record within that first year that they were a band.
And we've covered a lot of the bands that you mentioned. So we've obviously talked about Jawbreaker. We did 24-hour Revenge Therapy many years ago. By the way, that's the only episode that got us a write-up in the AV Club. They were not happy with our review of that album because we were not big fans. We've talked about Handsome. We've talked about Texas Is the Reason. And it was produced by Mr. J. Robbins, who also played guitar a little bit on the album and did some backing vocals. So everybody who's involved with this record, we have talked about in some way or shape or form before this. So kind of makes sense that we're finally getting around to it. Had you listened to this, Jay, before doing this for the podcast?
Yeah, I had. I mean, not a ton, but it was amongst a lot of other bands and J. Robbins and a lot of other associations you mentioned, both through the podcast and just, early 2000s, like where I was at musically, was very in this ballpark. So yeah, I might even own this on CD. I think I've listened to this and the record after this, Four Corner Night, a bit. And I think I've revisited it, here and there since. So, spot listen to it, not a lot of like huge familiarity, but kind of knew what the band was about, what they generally sounded like.
Got it. I had the
Probably.
MP3s, but I don't remember ever listening to it. Like I have
Mhm.
all the albums on my hard drive, but I could not remember what this sounded like. At first I was like, did he ditch the guitar and play piano? Like, what was this record? Like, I remember it was different, but I couldn't remember
Yeah.
what was different about it. So
My memory of it was slightly different than what it is. So we'll get into that.
right. So this came out, as mentioned, on Jade Tree, October of 1998, produced by J. Robbins. It was followed by Four Cornered Night in 2000 and Perfecting Loneliness in 2002. Those were also on Jade Tree. I believe J. Robbins produced Perfecting Loneliness, but I don't think he produced the middle album. Somebody, I think they just had a recorder. I don't think they had like a producer for that album. I don't recall. Or I don't see that anywhere. The album cover for this looks super emo. Like,
I love it.
it is. If you were like, what does an emo album cover look like? It would be
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
The lowercase font all the way across. Yep. Text.
Using
So-
type as graphic, like
Mhm.
sort of like.
I have a very love-hate relationship with this album cover. Because it kind of reminds me of like Mark Rothko. Like, I'm sure you guys are familiar with
Mhm.
his paintings. Like, it's very, it's just like shapes and colors, really. So there's not much to it. So from a technical standpoint, I kind of look at it and I'm like anybody could have done this, but I'm sure there's a lot that goes into this, like many trial and error of these shapes put in different places. But yeah, when I look at it, I'm just like, this is so simple. It's just like the simplest thing ever. But that orange, yellow, and white combination is very difficult to look at. Right?
I've always found it memorable. Like of all their album covers, it's the one I always remember. And as soon as I see it, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that record. So from that standpoint, I think it's super effective. It is very like expressive, experimental 90s graphic design. So it's of the time, which I also have a fondness for. But it's effective in terms of memory. Does it communicate anything about the band? Not really.
No, this could have been a 1960s jazz album with
Right.
like Stan Getz, or it could be like a Tropicalia album from like Brazil. Like you have no idea what this music's gonna look like or sound like. I when I look at that album cover, it's very like mid-century modern to me. That's what I would describe it as, which is not something I think about in terms of album covers. I don't think about music in that way, but it does give that vibe. Or it could be like a loungy, jazzy cocktail jazz album.
There's also we should mention that it was done by the guitar player of The Promise Ring, who is a band that was also on J Tree. So there's a connection there as well.
There you go. Another band
that would make sense. If you look at their covers, they're mid-century modern-esque slash like 90s subversions of that style. So makes total sense. Like Nothing Feels Good totally is in line with, I mean, it's a photo, it's maybe more interesting, but like from a style standpoint, it's in the same ballpark.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yep. We got some comments. I can't get through all the comments because there were so many, but on the final poll, Willie Dillon said, I really wanted to hear Uncle reviewed, but I voted for Jets to Brazil in the main poll, and I'm voting for them here as well. It's a solid rock album that's well engineered with nice crafted songs, and they have sometimes subtle but intelligent drumming, bass lines, and guitar. That's an interesting description. It's well engineered with nicely crafted songs. It's like AI wrote that. Willie, did ChatGPT write that? Andrew O.C., Jets to Brazil, I've almost requested that a few times. Good rocker, though now I feel like I should at least check out Uncle. You should check out Uncle. Scott Witt said, Jets has been my runner-up a couple times, so I have to stay with them. Plus, I can't reward a band that easily misspells Uncle. Oh, Scott, with your humor.
That's not the only word in that title that they misspell.
Correct.
Right.
They got into Prince territory with
it's sort of the thing.
I do like that on the finale poll. They had the 7 albums. Jeremy Amen commented, "Sure is a lot of Vadim showing up here." He was trying to choose between Mike Watt and Uncle. Justin Wexler went with the Jets to Brazil album. He said, I think this is the only good Jets to Brazil album. Interesting. I have not checked out the rest of the catalog, so I can't speak on that. And yeah, so let's get into this record. Everybody else, thank you for your comments. Thank you for your suggestions. We're already like 20 minutes into this, so we should probably talk about the record, because I hate those podcasts where they like have a premise to the podcast and then they spend like the first half hour not doing the thing that they're supposed to be doing. So, Jay, tell me one thing you liked about Orange Rhyming Dictionary by Jets to Brazil.
I really like the vocal here, and I don't remember being this impressed by the vocal when we did the Jawbreaker review. Maybe that's a candidate for us to revisit, but I love the tone. It's a little raspy. It's got some grit to it. You can tell from a range standpoint, it's a little limited, but he really sings from his chest, which makes a huge difference. Like there's a conviction to it and a clarity. I also like how he uses rhythm and phrasing to create the hooks. It reminded me a lot of shit, I just drew blank from the Clash.
Joe
Strummer. Thank you. It reminded me a lot of Joe Strummer, which I don't think I had ever made that connection before listening to them or listening to him or this record. But I think it all just loaded up in my brain of like, oh, like I get vocally, like it's in that space, which I really appreciate, because he does the same thing where he creates, hooks and dynamics with like just how he spaces things out, or he'll push, some of these songs he's pushing vocally to create a sense of urgency, and then he'll pull back and sort of fall behind the music. I love that. I think Starry Configurations is a good example of that, just in that little chorus where the line is apple of your, and he like pauses and then he delivers eyes, and it's just like little subtle things like that, like working within his range and like what he's good at, and like figuring out how to drive the songs that way.
Dear infatuation, you do not see me. Die here beside you in see-through obscurity. Governess, fancy-less, will sound the alarm. Drum up some simple turn for you. To eat these apples from your eyes. Emptiness fills room, and your love bud goes full bloom. You don't love me.
Conrad is another good example where like musically that song starts and it's nice, it's like, okay, but then the vocal comes in and everything changes. You're like, oh, okay, I get where we're going now. Like this is got character, and the vocal is suddenly creating some urgency, and I'm like interested where we're going to go, and it just pulls in your attention. I think that's a really good example of a song where musically you can kind of get a feel for what the band's about, which is good, but then when it's combined with that vocal, you just hear something like special come out of that. So I think to me that's the centerpiece on the record. There's a ton of dynamics going on here. A lot of those are vocal dynamics in terms of, like I mentioned, but also musically, there's a ton. Like Morning New Disease is a good example of that. Song starts off a little angular and you're like, where are we going? And it's kind of syncopated, and then boom, it kicks into this kind of 4/4 driving thing, and then it pulls back into the syncopated like halftime part, and then the chorus gets big and lush. So you get just musically all these dynamics, and then the vocal is creating another rhythm within that I think is really effective. So yeah, I think that the thing that works best for me is just a band that is dynamic but very accessible. Like it's not too post-hardcore and punky and aggressive. It's got some interesting elements from that. Musically, it's pretty accessible, and then you've, I think, got a really compelling vocal over top that just plays with rhythm, uses phrasing really effectively, and just, I think, creates a really interesting, unique sound. So that's what worked most for me. How about you, Tim?
Well, I'm going to take it from a different angle and say I'm very thankful that he decided to like experiment on this record, like opening up with Crown of the Valley and having a wah, which is not something I've ever heard in a post hardcore emo. Like even the guitar tone is much different than you would normally hear, and I like that aspect of this record. There's a little bit of keyboard on this record. Resistance is Futile has this, which is also the name of a Manic Street Preachers album, is got this great like weird little keyboard part that it doesn't make itself like completely obnoxious. It's a nice little thing that's like tucked into the song.
There's glass in this rug, tiny splinters pass, all just missiles to bloodstream, lead and water, collects and liver, transmit signals inside me. Pass me the remedy, get this chip out of my head. Subject There's gas in one lung. Should we need
There's like a lot of those touches where I read that he took like a year off from making music and he went and got like a regular job. And I think that allowed him to like separate himself from the Jawbreaker aesthetic and really create something new and interesting here. Because there's a lot of stuff that's like, you know, you mentioned in Morning New Disease, like that's a huge big bend that's very like emo 90s. You know, I could hear that in like Cursive and that kind of stuff. And that happens a couple times throughout the record where you get those like dissonant bends that are, you know, that's like a double bend for what do they call that? The boomer bend. That's what Rick Beato calls it.
What?
Like calls it the boomer bend because every boomer guitar player plays.
That's funny.
So like that aspect of taking something that was kind of rigid and now expanding it, and also helps that he's got really good players with him. I'm speaking of Blake Schwarzenbach, to have Jeremy and Chris, who are established guys who know that world of like emo post-hardcore, but are going along for the ride and doing something just a slightly bit different, slightly more adventurous. I liked hearing that. So that's what worked for me. Vadim, since you were the behind this pick, what works best for you on this?
So I think what you guys said, all those things for me as well, particularly the vocals, which is funny because I think the vocals I wasn't quite sure about the first time I heard the band, you know, like I remember when I got that CD in 99, I was kind of like, I don't really know how I feel about this. They're definitely unique, you know, but it's kind of like a make or break, I feel like, for some people when they first hear it. But I've grown to really, really, really love his vocals. And in fact, I think this is probably my favorite Blake performance from his entire discography, which I know some Jawbreaker fans would like cringe at me saying that, but I think this Jets to Brazil record is like most consistent for him in terms of like picking his vocal melody and also the way in which he pronunciates things. Is it pronunciation or enunciation? I can never remember the difference between the pronunciation and enunciation.
Jay, you want to Google that?
Okay, it's not just me. But you guys know what I'm saying. It's like
I think it's enunciate.
Every word is very clear. You can like, I mean, if I were to transcribe this record, you'd be able to do it very easily. Unlike where something like Elliot, for example, like it sounds like very slurry, or Jeremy Enoch or something, like he's very slurry in the way that he sings. So it's like, it's very difficult to understand what he's saying some of the time. And another thing that I really like is you can clearly tell that Blake is a reader. You know, he's got great vocabulary, and the way in which he strings together sentences, and not just rhymes, but like the actual sentences themselves are like very vivid, and they're almost written as if it was like a classical writer, like a classical novelist of some sort, like a Kerouac or something like that. And so I really enjoy that. And on this particular listen, I didn't ever put it together, but he reminded me of a guy named John K. Samson. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Weaker Thins, but the Weaker Thins is kind of in the same way where John Samson is like, he really writes like a novelist, the way that he kind of like puts his lyrics together. And I feel like Blake does that. The drum and bass playing off of each other is really great on this record. Jay, you mentioned there was some syncopation in Morning New Disease, and there's a few times on this album where like the kick and the bass really lock in together. And something that I wouldn't have appreciated about this when I was younger that I much more appreciate now is the ability to back off, to play with dynamics, you know, especially coming from like punk and hardcore. Like everybody always wants to be playing all the time at full volume. And this band does a really, really great job of like backing off when they're supposed to. I mean, they're in King Medicine, I think it's just bass and vocals that really like carry the entire verses of that song. You know, guitars drop out completely. There's sections when guitar is very sparse. It might just be like a held out chord, and the other instruments are really carrying it, or his vocals are carrying it.
Know that you'll soon go crazy, just like a whittling stick, hit by the coming daylight, caught up in a quick succession, appointed confession, really, stripped of all your armor, down to your very nature, beneath the haze and vapor gaze. You're such a willing stick to beckon that wanting knife, and you've been looking for it, the right blade all your life, saying who's gonna.
And I think I appreciate that a lot more as an older musician than I would when I was younger. But it's just very well put together. You can tell they've really kind of like spend a lot of time constructing these songs and making them where they're well written songs, but then like the instrumentation makes them even that much more impactful.
Yeah, I think my memory of this record was that it was maybe a little more abrasive, aggressive. I was kind of taken back a bit to just how restrained it can be, and now like refined, I think at times it is. And also the elements like you brought up, Tim, of like hearing some wah, which was like, whoa, I don't remember hearing wah. Okay. Yeah. And there's a couple tracks on here where they use it. So there's also like almost like a dance element to it. Like it's got a little bit of like a danceable groove to some of these songs, which you don't always hear in this type of genre. So something like Crown of the Valley, I think is a good example. I think, Tim, you mentioned one of the songs had a guitar that sounded like a synth. Which one is it? Oh, Resistance is Futile. It almost sounds like new wavy. Like it's just got enough like groove to it that like it's very accessible, especially as the first couple of tracks of this record. I don't want to say it's straightforward because I think there's a lot of interesting things going on here when you pull back the layers and really listen to it. And certainly his vocal is unique, but it's not as, I guess, weird or challenging as maybe I remember it being and expected to be as I revisited it. Seemed more straightforward, I guess, than I remember.
Interesting. I didn't have a real strong memory. Like I said, I thought that this was like piano. So I was completely off, but I knew it was a change. That's the only thing I was definitely sure of. I was like, I know this is different from what he was doing before.
Yeah.
I just didn't remember which direction.
But if you compare it to something like you mentioned Cursive as another band that maybe like we would have stumbled on this band because we were into Cursive. Like, yeah, Cursive is way over the top dramatic compared to this, you know. This feels like much more accessible, which I guess doesn't kind of make sense why it maybe was the best-selling record for Jade Tree in that way. Like it's fairly easy to get into this record. I wonder if I also was wondering, we were talking about you were talking about the vocal and how he enunciates and how that might be a little different than what he was doing in Jawbreaker or since. I wonder how much of that was the J. Robbins influence, because I think he sings quite a bit like that too, like doing vocals with him. Maybe that.
Oh yeah, there's some J. Robbins stuff happening.
Yeah, when
he gets like more up tempo, especially. Mm-hmm. Like there was something that reminded me of the melody in Paper Crowns by Burning Airlines, like just the way that he was like da 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 da. Like I was like, oh, that sounds like okay.
Mm-hmm.
I hate to crash the party because it's been a love fest so far, but for what didn't work, I'm actually in the opposite end of the vocal spectrum as you, Jay.
Oh my gosh, what?
I cannot connect with what he's doing from a vocal standpoint. And I like wordy vocalists. You mentioned like Tim Kasher can be a wordy vocalist. I like Gord Downey's very wordy vocalist. I don't have a problem with that, but there is something in the like nasally aspect of his vocal, which it almost comes across at times. He almost is giving like a British accent. I don't know if you picked up on that.
Yeah, you
But
do
like
hear
there's
British
something
accent.
about him singing from his mouth, it sounds like, that just like doesn't work for me. It just grates on me just a little bit. I wish there was just like more chest in his vocal, because it sounds
That's
like
funny, because I actually added that note of like, I thought he was like, for the most part, like pushing some decent air and like getting into his chest vocal on some of these lines, but
I think
I
it might-
definitely
yeah.
hear the there's like at times a weird accent, to the point where it made me wonder like, where's this band from?
I think the issue that I have is so much of it is speak singing essentially,
Yeah.
and there's not a lot of actually singing. So I kind of was like getting exhausted by the torrent of words. He's so verbose that I was just like getting lost. I'm like, I don't know what song I'm in. Like I'm remembering musical parts, but I couldn't connect the vocal to what the song was.
Oh wow.
I also feel like he's mixed way too loud. Like it's a pop vocal mix.
I feel like that's a J Robbins thing though too. Like his records tend to be produced that way.
Yeah.
But wow, that is the total opposite.
It is
from my take. Like,
and I listened to this over and over again. I'm like, why is this not working for me? Like, I really like this music is totally on par with like what I like. And like I said, it like, you know, I love some of the little touches on this record, but I would just find myself like, what freaking song am I on? What is this? And I was having a hard time connecting like the titles to what the songs were. Like you were saying about listening to a CD and you don't necessarily back in the 90s remember what all the song titles were. I was just like staring at this like, I don't know why this isn't working. I couldn't figure it out. So
that's funny, see, because it's kind of like what I said in the beginning, right? Like I feel like his voice is very make or break for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
However, I don't really agree that he doesn't sing notes. I think it's mostly sung notes on this album. I think maybe it's just there's a lot of vocal melodies where he stays on one note. It's like a single note melody, which pop singers do too. You know, like they don't necessarily like move all over the place. They could just be like a C, and you just kind of like say the syllable staying on the C the whole time, which he does do that. But I feel like you know, I feel like there's a lot of very memorable vocal melodies for me, at least. And again, I've been listening to this record for 20 something years. So, but I can totally see how his voice wouldn't connect with somebody. I could totally see that.
For me, it was, once I heard the Joe Strummer, to me, like analog, it made a ton of sense. And then suddenly like it clicked into place. I was like, oh, I get what this band's doing. I get where he's coming from. I get like his vocal style. And there was like an earnestness to it also that I appreciated. It just sounds like it's not double tracked, right? It's just straight up. It is dry. It is loud. I could see how not everybody would be into it, but for some reason, like it just connected on that level of like, and more in particular, maybe like the Joe Strummer solo stuff, like from the 90s, where it's the same kind of thing. Like he's up loud in the mix. He has a similar singing style, same tone, similar production. And like, for some reason, it just like connected there for me and worked out.
So is there anything that doesn't work for you on the record?
You know, I do think the middle of the record starts to get a little slow, a lot of slow intros. It just loses some of that urgency and dynamic. You know, you get to some parts that are bigger and change, but Starry Configurations, Chinatown, and See an Enemy is just a stretch of like, I feel like we're starting the same way, and the album starts to drag. Lemon, Yellow, Black, it gets chunkier and it brings up a little bit of a pop punk vibe, but it's not a killer song. It's okay. And then the second half for me starts to make more sense, like Conrad and King Medicine. Sweet Avenue is an interesting twist. It almost sounds like an Oasis song to me. You can hear sort of that British accent coming out there. It's also very acoustic. I do want to mention one song in particular that really threw me, and I can't believe you guys haven't brought it up yet. I Type for Miles sounds exactly like Heart Shaped Box.
I live in a hotel. I must keep writing if I'm to be better than everyone else. Like figure skating, like asphyxiating on your own, seeping fumes. You're just waiting.
Like
The rim shots, right? The 3 rim shots.
the guitar part and the drum part for the intro are Heart Shaped Box. Like when it starts, I'm like, what in the world? Like,
Yeah, I made a note of that too.
this is the same song. It changes after that, but I mean, the first couple of bars, you're like, holy shit, they're covering Heart Shaped Box.
Yeah, that's funny because that's not the only thing that made me think of Nirvana on the record. There's a really famous photo of Kurt Cobain wearing a Jawbreaker shirt too, which is really interesting that we're talking about this here now. But in Morning New Disease, the song I think all of us brought up in the beginning of the record, there's a lead line where it's just back and forth between 2 notes. And I was like, oh, that Smells Like Teen Spirit. Like, that's like what the Smells Like Teen Spirit verses are. It's just like those 2 notes, you know.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
just keep, so that was another
Yep.
similarity that I heard. But yeah, I totally heard the rim shots. That it was like dun dun, those 3 rim shots. I was like, that's Heart Shaped Box.
It's even the same effect on the guitar, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So that threw me. I was like, whoa, wait a minute. But yeah, the middle of the record to me is not as strong. And I think it starts fantastic, it ends strong, but that middle is a little soft. Anything not work for you, Tim, besides the vocal?
I think some of the songs could be a little shorter. There's a lot of 5+ minute songs.
Yeah.
It's a 53-minute album. Like you said, there's a lot of like little like intros that maybe could have been tightened up in terms of, you know, does it need to be this slow? Do we need this long sort of instrumental part? Like I guess because I've listened to so much since then, that when some of the stuff that sounded like original then, because so many bands have done that, it doesn't sound quite as interesting now. So like I mentioned about, like, you know, like everybody back then wasn't doing the dissonant bend that would become in, you know, but in the 2000s, a couple years later, everybody's doing that. And but I mean, overall, musically, I really like a lot of the record. It's just the vocal that kind of threw me for a loop. Vadim, anything that doesn't work for you?
The length, yeah, some of the lengths, like you said, but again, it's like once you get familiar with the songs, if you're just listening as a fan, over the years, it doesn't really bother me anymore because I know where the songs go. The only really thing that I would nitpick about it is Sweet Avenue, the closer. I just think that end section goes on for a little way too long, but I can kind of also see the reason for doing that. It's just like an outro of a record. So I kind of get it. You know, they're like they're bringing you home or whatever, you know? So that not really much. I want to counter Jay's middle being more boring, I guess is kind of what you were getting at, just because it kind of slowed down.
Yeah.
I actually love that about the record because I do really think that it ebbs and flows. And right in the middle of the record is Sea Anemone, that song, which starts out with just Blake on guitar and vocal, and then like slowly, you know, the rest of the band kind of comes in, and I feel like it's actually a perfect break in the album. It kind of really helps break it up to where it's not that it's upbeat to begin with, but you know, it doesn't have loud guitars. It just sort of like backs off, and it does that a few other times. Starry Configurations is by far my favorite song on the album. And I guess I just don't mind a slower and mid-tempo type songs. But yeah, not really too much that that I dislike about the album. I guess that's why I submitted it.
Yeah. Sea Anemone, I don't mind the slower vibe. I wish they had used that. I don't know if it's a mellotron or if it's a like a keyboard string section, but it comes in at the end of the song, which is like it's 5:20, so it's like the last 20 or 30 seconds. Would have really liked to have heard more of that on that song. That's such a cool sound for them to play with. If anything, I would have just liked this to get even weirder in terms of, oh, you're gonna throw a wah at me? Okay. What else you got? What other outdated guitar pedals? Got a roto vibe you want to throw on?
Well, for that, Tim, you would need to listen to the subsequent records because they did get a little bit more weird. Also, by the way, I just looked it up. Jay Robbins did all 3 albums. So
he did do the second one too. Okay.
Yeah, he did the second. I don't know if he produced it, but he recorded it, he engineered it. And then what else was it gonna? There was something I want to say. I'll come back.
All right. So this came out as we mentioned in 99. It's the best-selling Jade Tree album, but sometimes we talk about like where this fit into like the music scene in 99. Obviously there was a huge emo scene, but it wasn't the emo scene of like 2003, 2004, when those bands were like blowing up and you had Dashboard Confessional and then you're like your Fall Out Boys and that kind of stuff. Which I don't even know. Are they an emo band? Or who am I thinking? Newfound Glory? Like those, there were those bands that were getting on radio and stuff like that. But I can't imagine this being on the radio in 99. Like this is so not what was happening, like with Coldplay and Nickelback and Creed.
Yeah, no, I think this is a little ahead of its time in that way. I think if this record comes out in the 2000s, it's maybe a different story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there was no place on the radio for it in 1998, unfortunately.
Yeah, 98. It's a hard sell to radio programmers. All right, let's get into our overall ratings on this record. Worthy album, better EP, and decent single. Jay, where do you land?
I'm at a worthy album. I was critical of the sequencing in the middle. But I don't dislike any of those songs. I just think they could be sequenced differently and maybe give a different feel to the record. But yeah, I enjoyed this a lot. I really, like I said, I think it's worth revisiting for the vocal for me, and just the concept of like what they're doing with this band and the production. It's also got killer guitar tones, like very MIDI attack forward guitar tones. It's not like a big, thick, I mean, they're big guitar. It's a big sound, or can be a big sound, but it's not like I guess I remember this being maybe like more of a down tune, like, big amp sound. Mm-hmm. And it's not like that. It's more percussive and clean, like a Jay Robbins record. So,
well, that's the thing. I didn't think it sounded like Jay Robbins. Like when I think of Jay Robbins, I think about like the Hey Mercedes album.
Oh, wow.
You know what I mean? Like I think of a Braid, like those are like thicker guitar tones than this record, beefier sounding. This sounds like, I don't want to say solid state amp, but it has like a
I love the guitar tones on this. You're crazy.
Yeah, it sounds closer to like, I mean, he did Promise Ring too, and he did, I guess This Is the Reason, and it's in that that wheelhouse, like with those bands.
Okay, maybe a Black Star, not a solid state.
Let's say maybe Fender amps.
Okay, there you go. Do you remember what they were playing when you saw them by chance? What amps?
I don't, but I had to like double check because I was like tripping out. So this show it was a place in Philadelphia called the First Unitarian Church, which is like a very infamous venue. It's literally just the basement of a church, but like everybody has played there. It's amazing. And I just, for some reason, I have like very little recollection of that show. A lot of the stuff bleeds together, but that's why I was like, does this even exist? And I started searching for it, and I couldn't find any information. Then I finally found like some tripod website that had it listed, and it was in February 99. So it was only a few months after this record had come out.
Ah,
Yeah. But I don't remember. I do know for sure that they had another guitar player, and it makes sense now because like when I listened to this album in headphones to review for this podcast, there was definitely a lot of parts where there's two guitars doing different things. Not even just like there's a lot of double different amps playing the same thing also, but there's a lot of parts where there's like completely two different guitar parts, and I was like, okay, it makes sense that they needed somebody else to fill in that because it would have been lacking without it live.
they did have a second guitar player. It was Brian Mariansky from the band The Van Pelt, who actually just put out a new record after like 20 something years.
The two guitar parts on this record are critical. There's some songs where you're like, oh, this is going this direction. Then its second guitar comes in, you're like, oh, wait a minute. Like, okay, we got something going on here. There's two parts complementing each other. So super important. I'm guessing some of that's Jay Robbins potentially.
Yeah, he did play some guitar on the record. So
yeah,
that would be nice. Hire Jay to make your record, and you're like, oh, you want to make some play some licks on this record too.
Like this song sounds way too normal. Like, what can we do with it?
Yeah. Also, the fact that you guys pointed out that this wouldn't make it in mainstream radio or MTV or anything in the 90s is totally accurate, because I'm almost positive that Jay had to option or Blake had to option this to Geffen, because Jawbreaker signed him to like a multi-label deal, and then they broke up after Dear You.
It was 3 albums.
Yeah, but Dear You was the only record they did, right? And then they broke up immediately. And so I would imagine that he probably had to give them the option of releasing this first on a major, and I'm sure they were probably like, nah, and so Jay, and it makes more sense for them to be on J Tree anyway. So I'm glad it worked out like it did. But yeah, I could definitely not see this like breaking through, at least not like Jimmy World did like a couple years later,
No. Yeah.
I did look that up when I was reading. I read that he, they were on DGC, which kind of imploded by the end of the decade. So he was, he was obligated for another record, and I guess he called them and was like, whatever, we're making this album with a new band, and they were like, whatever, we don't care. Like, they had no interest in what he was doing.
They're like, who
we gave you a deal. We were giving them to everybody. We were just throwing them out the window to people.
Can I point out? I wanted to actually point out a line that I really like on the album that's relevant. So it's in the song "Sea Anemone," but he says, "And it's so nice sitting very still without those old shoes I can never fill." And I almost kind of wonder if that's a reference to Jawbreaker, because when Jawbreaker signed to DGC or Geffen or whatever, they kind of were looked at as sellouts from the punk scene. They were always just like DIY, and then here they are signing to a major label. And ironically now, that's who, like, almost across the board, that's what everyone agrees is their best album. I think it's their best album, the Jawbreaker record. But it's almost like when he says, to those old shoes that I can never fill. It's like he could, instead of trying to do Jawbreaker and trying to do more punk songs and like sort of like stepping away from it now, and instead of that, he's now sitting very still doing these more like quiet songs and sort of like reinventing himself as a musician. That's what I got out of it. I thought that was like, it's very fitting to sort of summarize his musical transition going from Jawbreaker to this album or to this band.
And he did have bands. I guess I for a while I thought that was like Jets to Brazil ended and then he just disappeared, and then came back when Jawbreaker like reunited. But he actually was in bands between then, which I didn't realize. He was in a band called The Thorns of Life, with Aaron Comet Bus of Crimpshire and Daniel C. And I don't know if they put anything out. Let's see. Doesn't look like it. And then he was in a band called The Forgetters in 2009. So like he was doing other stuff, but it just didn't get as much attention, it seems like. So made sense that he would go back to one or the other bands eventually.
Yeah.
So as far as, I would go with the better EP. The songs that I enjoy the most are the first three, Sea and Enemy, Conrad, and King Medicine. Those would be my 6 songs. But I think I kind of had the same problem with his vocal when we reviewed the Jawbreaker album. I need to go back and listen to it. It's just his voice just does not connect with me. It's just a tone thing. Like, it just does not work for me. So it kind of like, even though I'm hearing the words and some of them sound interesting, I couldn't lock in.
Yeah.
So, but I think I'm not saying this is not worth checking out. It's definitely,
Well, vocals are
checking
like
out.
that. I mean,
Mhm.
vocals are just like, sometimes you just don't connect with the tone or the delivery, and it just can't work. So I get it.
Vadim, this is a perfunctory question, but worthy album, better EP, or decent single?
I'll go with Worthy Album, of course. Yeah, particularly, Starry Configurations. It's got the chorus that's like, "Why must you treat me like you do?" I think that's like a very, very memorable line, or a catchy hook, I guess. And King Medicine, that "Tell me how you do that crazy trick where you walk around to sleep." There's a lot of things in here that like really catch my ears, and I'll have humming along for the next couple days. But again, I guess from just listening to it so much over the years, I don't know how much of it is just because it's ingrained in my memory, and like listening to it in my formative like musical upbringing years, like at the height of my like whatever you want to call emo listening, because I was like super into Promise Ring and Mineral and Sunny Day and Texas Is the Reason and Sensefield, like all that kind of stuff was like, I was huge into that at that time. But yeah, I would definitely go Worthy Album. I think all in all, strong songs, great vocal performance, regardless of if you enjoy the timbre of his voice. I like the sequencing. I think that great interplay between the musicians, intelligently written. They know when to step back. That's a big thing for me as far as bands playing with dynamics. So yeah, definitely Worthy Album.
Well, thank you for joining us. And we've set a new precedent with this episode that if you get both albums into the final, you get to come on the podcast with us and talk about your winner. To be honest, I would be curious about the Uncle album, because I think Jay and I would be switched for that record. That's just maybe my guess. But I love that album. I would, we'll get to maybe down the road. I'm not going to give anything away, but
yeah, and that's Uncle's definitely more in line of like what I'm into now, like the kind of stuff that I listen to. Maybe not even science fiction, actually, some of the later Uncle albums, but I do love science fiction too. It's a great album. Some of it's a little dated though, like with like the Mike D appearance. It's I don't know, it's a little weird.
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, you got to take it for the time period and that kind of thing. But I don't want to assume, Jay. Maybe you'll warm to it in a way that I wasn't expecting.
Stop assuming.
I think Jay would love the production of it, actually.
Yeah,
I think he'd appreciate the production.
I didn't know how big of a trip hop fan you are.
I mean, at this point, why not?
You know what? We need to come up with a country trip hop. There's country hip hop.
No, we don't.
Country trip hop.
We don't need to come up with that.
I'm going to second Jay on this one.
Okay. I'm going to make it happen.
I am all about people being creative and really just putting things out in the world. That's something that just doesn't need to be put out in the world.
Folktronica. I think we've said that before. Well, thanks for joining us, Vadim, from the West Coast. And I want to remind folks that if you want to vote in these polls that we have for these monthly tournaments, 27 albums enter, and eventually one album will leave. It might take an extra poll or two. Side note,
a little blood spilled, but we eventually get there.
Side note, I learned recently, I'm going to go on a little tangent here, but this is bizarre.
Uh-oh.
So speaking of overtime, because we had to have an extra poll, I learned that in the NHL, that if a game surpasses 6 overtimes, which has never happened, they've made it to 4. They've never made it to 6. You know what the rule is? They drop a second puck for the 7th overtime. So there's 2 pucks on the ice at the same time.
Why do I have to wait for 6 overtimes to see that?
Here's the crazy thing. If at the end of that it's still a tie and they go to an 8th overtime, they place 5 pucks on the ice, 1 in each faceoff circle, and each team gets 15 players on the ice.
Is this a joke?
No, it's not a joke. These rules were written in like the 1910s.
Yeah.
The final overtime, if they go to 9 overtimes,
You get 9 shots at the goalie's nuts.
Nobody knows what it is because it's in a sealed red envelope and it's never been opened. But there's an envelope that was sealed like in 1917 that explains what happens in a 9th overtime.
Wow.
So we need to come up with what I'm saying is we need to come up with an elaborate series of rules if the keeps ending up in a tie.
Oh my gosh.
You know,
Can I add to that really, really quickly?
Mhm.
So all I learned about sports is through Nintendo games because I don't watch sports whatsoever. And Blades of Steel was my game. I know Steven's going to love this, by the way, at the end of this episode. So I always thought that at the end of a hockey game, if it's tied, there's a shootout to win. I wasn't aware there was overtimes. And Blades of Steel messed me up really bad because I always thought that when 2 players fight, the loser goes to the bench because that's what happens in Blades of Steel. It's not both players get taken out. I found that out much later because I was like, oh, you get your ass kicked, you're out of the game, dude. Like, you know, you're out for 2 minutes or whatever. Like that's your like throwing salt in the wounds, right? Like you lost the fight and you got to sit out too.
Well, it actually makes more sense why you would fight. You'd be like, well, if you get the other guy to lose and you get him out of the game. But when you watch real hockey, you're like, why are you 2 idiots fighting? I don't understand this. You're both going to get taken out.
Exactly.
Oh man.
Did you also learn playing sports games that Bo Jackson is the greatest athlete of all time?
Yeah, and Tecmo Super Bowl.
Tecmo Super.
Yeah.
Yep.
Which, by the way, doesn't have 2-point conversions, which I also didn't know about until like 20 years later. I was like, there you could do 2 points. I always thought you had
well, they just added that in.
Yeah, that was after.
It was after that game. Yeah, that had been a college option, but I maybe the early NFL had it, but I don't know for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was a new. The NFL of today looks wildly different than the NFL of like 40 years ago. Like they're doing the kickoffs different. They're doing extra points differently.
That's why there's the most popular sport still. They keep changing. How did Baseball Stars mess you up too? Were you a big fan of that Nintendo game?
I think I did RBI. Okay. Baseball.
I did that too.
Yeah.
But Baseball Stars was. Well, one when you watch real baseball, were you like after playing RBI, you were like, "Wow, all the players are so thin." RBI baseball, they were all super chubby.
I assume there was some Mike Tyson's Punch Out in there too.
Oh man,
of course.
Soda Popinski.
Yeah, man. My brethren, kind of.
Oh my god.
Well, he was from the USSR, right? Soda Popinski.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. I remember you had to memorize so much.
So hard. It was so hard
to get through all that.
Oh my god! Like they made a character pink, like because he's just they needed to. How do you make somebody appear drunk all the time? Oh, let's just make him pink.
Sure.
Well, I mean, you only had 8-bit graphics. I mean, you can only do so much.
Yeah. No kidding.
That's what happens when you have cirrhosis. You turn pink.
We should create a video game channel on the Discord. I'm sure some people. I don't actually play any video games anymore. I think the last thing I played was like Tetris on my phone. That was probably.
I would love if you could get the classic NES stuff on like Apple TV, or I know you can get you can run it as like Sims on your computer, but like I'd love to be able to just pop it up on my TV like you used to as a kid and just play those games.
Oh my god.
I play them on my projector at home. It's so much fun.
How do you have an NES or do you have like
I have a modified
yeah.
PlayStation that has all the ROMs on the Yeah, but it's so much. You don't have to blow into the games. You just
Yeah.
pop,
Do
they're
they all
ready to
work well? They all look good and play
go.
well?
Yeah, they look great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That'd be
All right.
fun.
All right, gents, I got to wrap this up. We're
Yeah.
past my bedtime.
Me
So
too.
if you would like to suggest an album that makes it into one of these polls, go to digmeoutpodcast.com. That's where you can suggest your album. You can also sign up for the Box newsletter. Every week, the newsletter includes a release calendar of new releases, as well as 2 reviews of new albums or books or movies or TV shows relevant to 80s, 90s, and aughts music, which, by the way, we got to figure out our aughts poll 3-way tie. I forgot about that. I talked about it last week. We didn't take care of it. Previously, we were doing 80s episodes. This year, we're doing the aughts for our extra episodes exclusively at Patreon, which you can get to via dmounion.com or digmeoutunion.com. And lastly, if you like the podcast and you like classic NES video games, leave us some positive feedback over at Apple Podcasts. For Jay, I'm Tim. We're out, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Dig Me Out.